Hello, everyone. My name is Korkor, and I'm the founder and the CEO of the A.B. Korkor Foundation for Mental Health. Well, you know, our foundation, as you all know, focuses really on enhancing the awareness, removing the stigma, and enforcing the role of physical wellness in mental health. The flagship event in our foundation has been the 550-50, where we organize and run 5K in all 50 states in 50 days. We did that in 2018, we did that in 2019, but 2020 was canceled because of COVID-19. Well, one thing that was really intriguing and wonderful for me and for many of the people who participated is that uh, uh, many people have stepped up and talked voluntarily about their own stories. Learning from them for me was extremely helpful to understand what's happening out there in people's lives and what's happening in the communities. However, the fact that this event was not held this year in person, it was impossible for me to have those type of encounters and experiences and allow people to share their stories. That was helpful for others who participated in the event. Because of that, we decided to create a webinar series of which we will allow people to step in and share their stories. Because we feel that by doing that, we will help raise the awareness and remove the stigma associated with mental health. Well, Claire Yu, who's going to be joining us today, responded to the invitation that we had sent out. And today, she's willing to share with us her journey with mental health, especially in reference to the fact that she is an Asian American. So, Claire, it's been a pleasure. I know we've had a conversation earlier last week, and you have put together a really nice presentation for us. And we look forward to hearing your story. And I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions. So, thank you so much for willing to do this. And I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Korkor. It means a lot. Hi, guys. I'm Claire. I'm 18 years old, and I recently just graduated high school. So I'm really excited to be here today just because I think it's really, like for me personally, I love hearing other people's stories, and especially throughout these past months, a lot has been happening, especially within different communities, and it's important to learn about, perspectives outside of your own, especially as it relates to other ethnicities and the other cultures and other, I guess, like general different groups that you might not identify with, but it's always important just to sort of broaden your knowledge and learn more about them. So I have these presentation slides, and there's very minimal words on most of them. So if you guys want, you can always multitask and like have something else open and work on it. It's mostly just going to be me talking and kind of going through the slides with you all. And then at the end, I'll answer any questions that you guys might have. So without further ado, let's bring those up. All right. All right, so I guess for the presentation, I kind of wanted to do it into two parts. So the first part is going to be pretty short, and it's just me kind of explaining my background and kind of, telling you guys where I come from, both literally and like figuratively. And then after that, I'm just going to be jumping into more general, like Asian American and Pacific Islander struggles with mental health, and specifically talking about the Chinese American experience, because I'm Chinese American, and I think that my experience does not speak for all Asian Americans, as Asia is quite literally like the biggest continent, and there's so many different experiences and narratives that need to be shared. So I'm just hoping that I can like sort of, bring one piece to the entire puzzle. All right. So furthermore, in terms of my story, I kind of wanted to break it down even further into two different like sort of spheres. And the first one is community perceptions, and the second one is internalization of stereotypes. So in seventh grade, it was kind of the first time when I was dealing with anxiety and sort of the symptoms. And at that time, I didn't really have a label to put on it, because mental health, as you know, maybe for those of you who have been through junior high and still sort of remember it, it's very, at that stage, you're not really like cognizant of like thinking about your thinking and sort of like, stepping outside yourself and sort of reflecting on, what's going through your mind, right? So in seventh grade, I was so kind of lost. And the people around me who were open about mental health, most of them were not Asian American. So when I heard them tell about their stories, I was like, like I don't think I can, be as brave as them. And at that time, I didn't know why, but now I sort of have a better inkling of that. So in terms of 7th grade, I remember this one conversation I had with my friend, and where she would talk a lot about her symptoms of depression, and I'd be like, okay, what can I do to support you? I'm always here for you. I'm not a therapist, but I feel like, as a peer, I can do whatever it takes to sort of, comfort you in whatever way I can. But I also noticed that the friends that I had that struggled with mental health also tended to have bad grades or didn't show up to class, and all these other like sort of associations that were perceived as negative in my community. Because growing up Asian American, I was always taught that, you should always have good grades. That was very definitive of my identity. And looking back, that's not a really good mindset to have. Like, no one should be determined by like their numbers, their value isn't associated with that, et cetera, et cetera. But at that time, I sort of mistakenly labeled mental health as something that if I shared it out loud, like maybe my grades would go down, or like if I acknowledged what was happening inside my head, like, something bad would happen to me that would delegitimize my identity, or like knock me down a notch in terms of like me being Asian American and me supposedly being like, the model minority, if that makes sense. So that's sort of the community perceptions aspect of it. Moving through high school, I think it got better, and I learned that the anxiety that I was experiencing was really, boiling down to just having extra energy. So like, for example, if people like sleep at night and they sleep at like maybe like 10, 11, like my extra energy would make me sleep like a little later. And I'd realize that the extra energy I had didn't have to be a negative thing. Like, instead of worrying about everything, doing everything under the sun, thinking about everything and nothing at all, I realized that I could turn that negative energy into something positive. For example, staying up an extra hour and like finishing a project, or like working ahead, or like, just using my energy and channeling into something positive that benefits both me and the people around me. So I guess that's kind of like sort of a very, very short overview of how I dealt with anxiety, in terms of, turning this excess energy into something that's productive and something that moves me forward instead of holds me back. But obviously everyone deals with it to a different degree, and the way that I dealt with it is not something that I would recommend everyone deals with it. All right, so for the second part, is just like the internalization of stereotypes. So I kind of thought that because the Asian Americans around me didn't tend to talk about mental health a lot, especially in high school, because everyone's moving at 1,000,000 miles per hour and everyone's, doing everything again. And I felt like because no one else was talking about it, I felt like I couldn't talk about it. And so I was basically trying to like internalize these stereotypes that, Asian Americans are pretty like, reserved. They don't really talk a lot about their feelings. They don't show emotion as often as maybe other people do. And so this, combined with like sort of the community perceptions of how I was supposed to act, sort of, stifled my growth in terms of, coming out, talking about it, kind of like, removing the stigma associated with anxiety and just mental health in general. And now that I reflect on my high school experience and having lived through that, I feel a lot better, because I feel like I've been able to talk about it more, just because high school's over. I closed that chapter, and I feel like I can sort of talk about it now, since it's sort of out in the open, and it's, how do you say, it's very like, like, it's not as high stakes anymore, because I feel like I've come to terms with my identity and how I present myself. So I guess like with my story, it's still ongoing, but I feel like, the trouble sometimes in 7th grade and high school is mostly come to an end. And now as I move forward, I realize that in college, I'm going to have a lot more resources, whether it's peer-to-peer counseling, like office hours, like so many people who are there to support me. I'm really thankful for that, but I know that this is not the case for all Asian Americans in our community. So next, I really, really want to talk about sort of the general challenges that Asian Americans face, and I specifically want to talk about the Chinese American community, just because, again, this is the community that I'm a part of, and I feel like I can speak to that more as opposed to Asian Americans as a general group. So we're going to break this down into 3 sections. The first, I'm just going to be sharing with you some statistics. They're very general, very broad. So those of you who like numbers and kind of, learning about like general and broad statistics about the Asian American experience will definitely sort of understand this and kind of vibe with that. Second part is kind of these overarching concepts. So basically there are these pillars, I would say, that sort of define the Chinese American experience and sort of act almost as barriers to seeking out mental health help or even acknowledging that mental health exists and needs to be, addressed. And then the third part is common misconceptions. So I'm going to read to you guys a bunch of sort of quotes and kind of walk you guys through sort of like the thinking behind them and how it ties back to like the Chinese American culture and how that can also prohibit people from getting the help that they need. All right. So here on this slide, there are two like graphics, and I know there's so much on there in terms of words, but if you guys just want to read through them, and I'll just kind of speak to sort of a little bit about like the general like numbers that you see. So 7.4% of Asian Americans and 9.4% of Pacific Islanders do not have health insurance. And obviously health insurance is a big barrier, especially in minority communities when it comes to seeking out mental health help. And some insurances don't even cover that. So like I would say that was more like a physical barrier that some people in our community face when it comes to seeking out help. The next one is like language barriers and kind of like general like why Asian Americans might not be able to, seek out help successfully. So like they might have the insurance, they might have the financials covered, but when they actually sit in the room and they actually like discuss things, they might feel like it's not a productive experience and it's not something that they would want to come back and, do it again. On the right, it's more speaking to Asian women specifically. All this data is from Mental Health America, but this one is a specific study done on Asian women. And it was actually kind of hard to find because part of the reason why Asian Americans actually have this like stigma and like all these like disparities that people talk about is because there's not a lot of research that is done on certain ethnicities. And most of the research is mostly concentrated as like, Americans as a whole, or like, broken by gender, or might I say more leaning towards like the majority group instead of the minority group. And because of that, this is one of very few studies that have been done targeting a certain ethnic group in mental health. And if you want to read through these, it kind of just says how women feel, like their self-esteem is on the line. They feel like they have to stay silent, and they kind of, carry the burden of having to save face for their families, which is something that I will kind of talk about more as we go on. So if you guys just want to read through these, some of these might be, might struck a chord with you because it might be something that you might relate to, or someone who's talked about it. But either way, like it's just important to know some of these statistics, especially as it relates to like Minority Mental Health Month. All right. So now we're going to be talking about sort of these buzzwords, I would say, and kind of breaking down what they mean and exactly what it does to prevent Asian Americans from seeking out help. So the first one is this big word called intergenerational trauma, intergenerational meaning kind of transcending generations. And there's quite a bit of pieces to unpack here just because this word, while it's pretty, easy to say, it's just a couple syllables long, it actually like signifies like a lot of different factors that you have to consider when you talk about intergenerational trauma. So the first one is the most straightforward one. So like Asian American families who immigrate here and they come from a country that is, I guess you would say like less fortunate, like traditionally than America, they might have like they might have experiences that they bring to this country and pass down into their further generations. For example, a refugee family comes to America and they start a family, right? While the kids don't experience the trauma that the parents experience, they still go through like the psychological like effects of that trauma is passed down to the children, even though the children might grow up very happily or like they might have a very stable home environment. If the family does not have that stable home environment, for example, like that's just one example of many different ways that trauma can be caused, the children can still feel the effects of that. And so that's kind of breaking down the word intergenerational in the sense that just because children who are a product of immigration don't necessarily experience the same things to the extent of their parents, it doesn't mean that they're free from that trauma. They still carry sort of like the relics of that psychological damage, and they carry that, throughout the generations. So another example of this would just be like more like on the biological side. For example, if parents have high cortisol levels, which kind of is a symptom of long-term stress, they can actually pass that down to their kids. So their kids might have neuroendocrine and epigenetic changes. Sorry about that. And even though like the kids might have nothing to be stressed about, like for example, they still might have those because it's a relic of sort of that genetic standpoint that their parents sort of passed down to them. In terms of intergenerational trauma as a whole, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hmong, and Laotian Americans are more likely to suffer from depression just because they tend to come from backgrounds in which intergenerational trauma is exacerbated by a lot of the experiences that the parents face, and then they pass that down to their kids. So this is just one of the few pillars that kind of hold up why Asian Americans maybe experience more mental health issues than normal, or why you might say like, oh, but they grew up here, why do they have like a mental health issue? Well, it's because of that intergenerational trauma and how trauma is not just limited to just one generation. Yeah, it's a lot to unpack, but I think that in general it's something that's really important to understand because it also relates to a lot of the current issues that we hear about right now. All right. So the second one is pressure to succeed. And this one is more, I would say some of you guys probably know about this more. But it's basically kind of goes hand in hand with the model minority myth and kind of how, especially like in different Asian countries, like a lot of people feel like they have to like be doing things 24/7. For example, in Hong Kong, they have like the most work hours per week, globally, and 60% of residents are apparently stressed out by their jobs. They have a lot of different statistics that show that everyone there is always sort of hashtag like on the grind, right? But not in like a healthy way. Like sometimes some people can manage that healthily, but it's not something that should be expected of everyone, right? So a lot of people just feel like overwhelmed and they don't have anywhere to turn to because it's sort of normalized in the community. Like, for example, if you're struggling, right, but your community seems to be doing fine, like everyone else is doing the same work as you or even more, or at least your perception is that everyone else is staying afloat, but you're sort of like, kind of half in and half out of the water. You might feel like there's something wrong with you and that like you're supposed to be able to handle this workload, but you can't, right? Yeah, imposter syndrome. Yeah. I'm looking at the chat right now, and yeah, Vivian said it really, really, really nicely. Imposter syndrome, like you feel like there's something wrong with you instead of the environment, and you feel like you're sort of, you're supposed to be someone that you're not, and you feel like maybe your Asian American identity, whatever that might be, is sort of compromised as sort of a consequence of not being able to like fulfill what's expected of you. So an example I put was like the work, right? So like adults face work, and then students who are in school, right? Like they might feel like they're treading behind, even though in reality they're doing like just fine or even more than fine. But because they surround themselves with, a very competitive community or like someone of their own like ethnic identity that is like, super competitive, like they might, perceive themselves to be like lagging behind. And then they won't seek help because they feel almost like guilty or ashamed or any of those negative emotions that kind of bar a person from reaching out for help. All right, this word is acculturation, and I had no idea what this word was until I started doing some research with the Asian Mental Health Collective. And so I might not explain this like the best way I can, but it's a really big word, and just like intergenerational trauma, there's so many different like facets to it. So I'm kind of going to be talking about it in a more broader sense, and if you guys want, like maybe we can discuss it a little further, or you can like do some research on your own, whatever works for you. So basically, like acculturation is this general term that describes sort of three different facets: the social, psychological, and cultural change when it comes to balancing two or even more cultures. So when you talk about it in terms of the Asian immigrants' relationship to, for example, like their family and their children, the next generation, there's a lot to unpack. So acculturation actually has 4 different outcomes. The first of which is assimilation, which is strong ties to the dominant culture and weak ties to the ethnic one. The second one is separation, which is you reject the dominant culture and you preserve the ethnic ties. So for example, someone who's Chinese American sort of rejects like the Western culture and they more identify with their Chinese identity. The third of which is integration, which is having strong ties to both cultures, sort of like the best of both worlds. And then the fourth one is marginalization, which is rejecting both cultures entirely. So what this means is really just the extent to which a family is able to assimilate into the like quote unquote like American identity really sort of has an impact and plays a pretty large role in terms of how the family experience is and if there are any like mental health issues that develop out of that. If there's conflict between a parent and a child that stems from sort of like the parent being acculturated a certain way and the child being acculturated a different way, they can often butt heads, and that kind of leads to a lot of psychological disorders. So I guess where I'm trying to go with this is really just kind of like talking about the nuances of how immigration, while it's a physical thing, it also has a lot of mental consequences, both positive and negative. As you've seen, like sometimes people can hold on to both cultures and they're able to balance it really well, right? The best of both worlds. But on the flip side, you might end up kind of like falling short and feeling like you don't identify with either, or like you identify with one that's not where you live. Like I identify with my like Chinese culture more than my American culture, and that makes me feel like isolated, for example, because I'm surrounded by people who are identifying as Americans. Okay, so then I guess another thing with acculturation is just that like in Asian cultures, and this is based on this research that I read, a lot of the family like sort of conflict stems from the parent being very like low warmth and high control, whereas in Western cultures it's more like the parents are more like higher warmth and less control. And I think maybe you guys can sort of speak to that a little bit more, but it's more just like different styles in parenting can lead to a lot of conflict with children. So for example, in Chinese culture, it's okay to be, pretty harsh on your kids and have that high level of control, like controlling, meaning like what they can do and what they can't do, whether they can go out or not, stuff like that. And having relatively low warmth in terms of like praise or like, hugs or like physical displays of affection and also like verbal displays of affection. Like that's pretty normalized in Chinese culture. Like parents aren't expected to like hug their children like every 10 seconds or like do stuff that it displays like warmth constantly, whereas in Western culture there is a higher level of that and a lower level of control. So again, this is a generalization because we know that Western culture is not a monolith, but in terms of like the research, it shows that in the Western cultures there tends to be more autonomy, meaning that the parents let the kids sort of experiment and sort of experience things on their own. Whereas in the Chinese culture, it's more like, we'll hold you back from anything that we think might be unsafe to you, and we'll like sort of shelter you until like a much later age. Again, this is like sort of like a general overview and not really indicative of all the specific cultures and stuff. All right, and then the third is stigma, which is like a big word. We all know that we want to destigmatize mental health, right? But how do we do that exactly? I guess like in Chinese American culture, mental health is definitely stigmatized in the sense that one, if you have like issues, it's mostly like, oh, you gotta like talk it with your family, you gotta like keep it in the family level, right? And there's this issue of saving face. Like, what if other families find out? How does that look and how does that reflect on your family? So like individuals feel like they have not just their own burden to carry, but also the burden of their family. So it's kind of like you got to balance, more than you can handle, right? And then another thing, I guess, it's kind of talking from personal experience. I live in a suburb where I think 2 Chinese American suicides have happened in the past 8, 9-ish months. And what I've noticed from them as sort of like someone who's heard about them secondhand is that there's a lot of like covering up of like the suicides in terms of like not a lot of people know, right? It's very like kind of like on the low, like you don't, it's not broadcasted everywhere. I think that like the stigma associated with suicide is something that needs to be unpacked, especially like probably like in greater detail. But in general, it's just like there's so much, like I don't even know where to start. Like there's just so much like this generalization of like not wanting to talk about it, just like refusing to seek out help because it reflects badly on your family, maybe senses of guilt or like, oh, like I caused this by myself, or this feeling of like, oh, I'm just simply not strong enough mentally, like I need to just, you know, like toughen up sort of, right? And this might relate a little to other cultures. Yeah, as Vivian said, I think, yeah, she's doing a really good job like kind of elaborating on what I'm saying and also adding more concrete information. Like the quote, "There is no such thing as mental health," is pretty universal in terms of different cultures, and how some cultures actually don't have a language where they have, you know, a word for mental health or a phrase for mental health, right? So it really depends on, you know, sort of the culture and, you know, kind of like how they talk about mental health, if at all. All right, and then the next one, I'm just gonna be doing some like common misconceptions. So I'm just gonna walk you guys through a few quotes, and basically the quotes just kind of describe sort of the barriers that a lot of Asian Americans face when it comes to talking about their mental health or getting help. So first one is, I must be successful and cannot show signs of weakness. This is pretty self-explanatory, just because it's like very universal in the sense that, you know, Asian Americans are supposed to be like this model minority. They're supposed to be successful, right? And they can't, you know, like show anything that, you know, disproves that. Second one is, I'm ungrateful for all I have. This is especially true for children of immigrants whose parents go through greater struggle to bring them to this country, or, you know, to get, you know, somewhere like to get somewhere better, if that makes sense. Yeah. So like like when parents are like, oh, like, you know, we struggled through so much more, like what do you have to be stressed about, or what do you have to be upset about? It is true that like a lot of times parents do struggle more, but it's definitely not helpful or productive to sort of use that struggle and like compare struggles and sort of use that to delegitimize like a child struggle. Yeah, for sure. Third one is, it's disrespectful to my spiritual beliefs. This one is more just focused on religion. For example, in some cultures, suicide is viewed as a sin, which if you hear that, like that's definitely like something that you would want to avoid, right? Because it's like, oh, like, you know, if my religion doesn't permit me to talk about mental health, or if my religion frowns on effects of mental health, like what am I doing? You know, it's kind of it's very detrimental to even being open about it, and much less like seeking help. Another one is, I don't know how to talk about it with my relatives, which is, again, either the language barrier, just a cultural barrier, just, you know, having nothing to stand upon in terms of common ground can really cause like family friction in terms of like, oh, like if I want to keep it within the family, but my family isn't receptive to it, like what do I do? Next one is, I've tried therapy before and I didn't find it helpful. This one is kind of much to impact as well, because a lot of times when individuals are able to get therapy or able to get help, they actually don't come back for the second like session, or they don't come back at all, because they realize that there's just so much like cultural like there's different like cultural barriers. Like if your therapist is someone that can't relate to your culture, or doesn't make an attempt to relate, or maybe dismisses some of the stuff that you say, or doesn't recognize some of the stuff you say, you know, can't vibe with you on a personal level, like all these different factors, like you might feel like you're disconnecting with them and you can't really, you know, express yourself in the way that you want to. So it's important that people who work in mental health, you know, have like cultural competence and are able to, you know, be informed on different cultures, so that, you know, when clients come to seek them out, they're able to speak to multiple different cultures and be fluent in multiple different identities, and kind of learn to resonate with different clients depending on what their heritage is, and being respectful of, you know, their ethnicity, their traditions, and their culture in general. All right, so I feel like I kind of breezed through those really quickly, and there's still so much I'm still learning about. I'm still researching and still, you know, trying to keep myself informed and educated. But if you guys have any questions for me, I'd love to answer them. I don't know if I should exit out of the slides or not, but I hope you guys found this somewhat informative. Again, I'm still learning, but yeah.
Yes, you go ahead and exit the slides. And yeah, hello again. Well, that was actually wonderful. You breezed through this one fairly quickly there, and lots of wonderful information. Um, First of all, let me say that you did the 550/50 with us last year in 2000 in Illinois, Naperville.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Was that a good experience?
Yeah, it was really awesome. Like during that summer, I really wanted to I wanted to do like different races because I thought that would be really fun instead of just running on my own, right? I can run with other people. So I kind of just Googled like, what are some races that are for like mental health awareness, because like it's cool to like be able to do something that you love, which is running, but also do that for a greater purpose that's bigger than yourself, right? So like it was so fun. I remember thinking like wow, like it's like so many people are gathered here and they all share a common purpose, whether you're running for yourself or running for a loved one. Like it really kind of makes the experience a lot more powerful and more memorable, especially since you're running alongside people who sort of share a common thread with you. I don't know if that made sense, but it's just like when I went there, I remember I felt very like welcomed, very included, and very like I'm here and I'm ready to like do something purposeful, right? Instead of just like sort of running aimlessly, if that makes sense.
That's awesome. I have a question, and actually, there's a few questions coming up. I think someone is asking about, maybe expanding a little bit about epigenetics.
Okay.
And, you know,
I
I,
mean, the thing is, like, I'm trying to like think back to like junior year of high school when I learned about like different like in biology and stuff like that, and like the research I did was just saying mostly just saying how like cortisol levels can be passed down through generations, and how like I don't know if I'm saying this right, but like certain how do you say it? Like this isn't really intergenerational though, like in terms of like how do I say, like certain genes like they can be like like kind of like, okay, I don't know if this is a good analogy, but like if you have like a wire or like a rope and you like twist it so there's like less like surface area, right? So like some of the like receptors aren't like expressed, if that makes sense, whereas if you like unwind it, it's like there's a lot more that are able to like take in signals and stuff like that. So it's just like saying that like if you experience like a lot of stress and stuff like that, it can really alter like like the foundations of like genetics, and it can like sort of lead to issues later on in terms of like being stressed is usually like a temporary thing, right? Like today I'm stressed but tomorrow I'm good, right? But in terms of like long-term issues, like if you're constantly stressed every day, like that really like kind of wears down like sort of like the biological aspect, and you can sort of have like that permanent like expression in which like some genes aren't expressed or some are like over like exposed, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm like I again like I don't really know much about biology. It's just like I just saw this like fact about like cortisol levels and how they can actually be passed down from parent to child, and I thought it'd be cool to share that. Yeah.
sounds good. Understand. I think I understand where you're coming from. I think it's been shown that emotions and and even experiences can really traumatic experiences can really have a significant effect, structural effect on your, especially if they're not addressed immediately. Structural effect, it could be stoichiometric effects, and about the on the DNA, on the genes, which really impact a lot of your chemistry, and so I can see where you're coming from. I have a question from someone who says, I am white, but I'd like to be able to show my compassion and support to my Asian American friends. Is there a particular language or particular words that I could use or
In
should
terms of
use?
language, I mean, unless if they are not really fluent in English, then that's another issue in terms of like how you communicate with them, whether you want to learn their language and maybe take some time, like kind of brushing up on those skills. But if you both speak like a common language, I would say um, like just try listening, because I feel like a lot of people, when like whether you're Asian or not, like doesn't matter ethnicity, like when you're dealing with something, sometimes the best thing that a friend can do is listen to you, right, without interjecting or like saying their piece, right? Like you just want someone to just sort of be there for you and listen to what you have to say. So like if, for example, your Asian American friend comes to you and it's like, hey, can I take up like a little bit of your time, like I would say like the best thing you could do is be there for them. And then when they tell you, just like listen to the stuff that they're saying. And then once you start listening, you'll learn that you're learning more about their culture. Because a lot of times, again, with mental health issues, it might be very connected with their culture, right? So when you listen, you're also taking in information, you're also educating yourself, right? So that when they come back, or like, the next time you meet up and they want to talk about it some more, you're there and you're like a little bit more informed than you were before, right? So I think like in terms of like educating yourself, it's cool to do research and it's cool to like maybe like Google, like learn about like Asian American experiences, but it's also just important to just like hear it straight from the source, right? Instead of like, like researching like, oh, like I heard that, your ethnicity is, prone to this, or like does this more, or like has a high pressure to succeed, right? That might be true, but like just having that personal level of like, I heard firsthand from this individual who's Asian American, yeah, like this person who's Asian American, and they've told me that they struggle with this, and I know that their struggles aren't definitive of the entire Asian American struggle, because again, the East Asian American experience, not at all indicative of the South Asian experience, is not indicative of the Southeast Asian experience, is not indicative of the Central Asian experience, etc., right? So it's just like, just listen. I know that's like, I don't know if that's like the best answer, but I would just say like keeping an open mind, listening, and as Jessica said, like experience is different for everyone, so just keeping like that in mind as you listen, and just just being a receptive friend, which I'm sure you are already. So yeah.
I completely agree with you. I think, in America, we call it a melting pot. But in reality, what we have we have a lot of cultures, and we have a lot of beliefs, or understanding or sensitivity that might be totally different between different cultures. What we would say to someone who may be Chinese American might appear differently to someone who is of a different culture, or certain behaviors that you might do that might seem really very acceptable to an immigrant from Norway or Germany, that might be really appalling to someone who is from India or China, in terms of whether behaviors or words or things like that. So we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to be understanding of what those type of things really mean. I have a question for you, myself. How about in your schooling? You've interacted probably with a lot of kids who may have uh, parents of two different cultural background. So you have a dual culture. I was really intrigued by your comment about the acculturation. My question to you: what about the situations where you have a parent who is of one culture and probably a first generation, and then you have a spouse who is Native American, or who is actually American, you know, American, who's from, two or three generation immigrants. So what do you see happen there?
I mean, do you want it from like the partner's perspective or like the children's
From the same,
perspective?
yeah, from the children, yeah, from the children,
Um,
from the kids that you've interacted with in school, and how did you see, for example, the kids, are they more influenced by one parent or the other, by one culture or the other, by, how did you see that in some of your friends in school?
well, I mean, I would say like the school that I go to, it's like, I don't know how else to say it, but it's not super diverse. It's like, especially depends on the classes that you take. You sort of put yourself in a bubble, right? And then you look around and you're like, everyone's sort of similar to me in terms of like ethnicity. Like a lot of people who take the same classes of me as me, they tend to be Asian American or white. And so because of that bubble, it's hard to get exposed to different cultures. However, I've been to like other different high schools just to visit and to do like conferences in, and like people who have like multiple different cultures, like they tend to like obviously like yeah, it is possible to like retain both of them equally, like a 50-50, but usually it's like they usually are more influenced by one over the other. But then from their parents' perspective, it's really about like how the parents handle it. For example, like if one parent, like assuming that there's two parents and they both like have like custody over the child, like if one parent like compromises in terms of like in for like certain aspects of our lives, we're going to be doing things like the Chinese way, right? And then other aspects of our lives, we're going to be doing things the American way, right? Then they set like a boundary in terms of like how much they want the kids to be influenced by each culture and like, you know, at what frequency, right? And where is the line being drawn, right? In that sense, I feel like that's like sort of the way that I see it when it's like a really healthy like family dynamic, is that the parents are able to communicate properly in terms of like we're gonna be doing things that are reflective of my culture, but we're also going to be doing things that are reflective of, you know, my spouse's culture, right? And together we're able to sort of find that perfect balance between like those dual cultures and stuff like that. I would say like a lot of times like there's families where it's like both are immigrants, but they're immigrants from like different ethnicities and stuff like that. It's like that one's a little bit more tricky, and I feel like I can't really speak to that just because both my parents are from China. So it's like I don't think I would have like the right thing to say in terms of that. But I think that there are resources online that can, and I think there's research that has been done with families where it's like there's multiple different cultures and how they acculturate, if at all, and the level of assimilation and stuff like that. So I would definitely recommend like doing like research online, which sounds kind of vague, but I feel like that would be the best way to learn like from a statistical standpoint. And obviously if you have like individuals that you want to talk to and kind of learn more about their experience, like if they're willing and open to do so, like you can definitely like, you know, talk to them about it. But I just like don't want to make any generalizations more so than I have already, just because I feel like the experience is so different for every family, and I don't want to sort of like put them all, you know, under the same blanket, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, let's go back specifically to you and to your story. Can you tell us a little bit more about your stories with mental health?
Yeah. I mean, like I kind of talked about it at the beginning. I feel like it's like, how do I say, like I felt like, okay, so like this is gonna be a little weird, but like in terms of um like high school, like I kind of pinned like my mental health experience on sort of like my college application, if that makes sense. Because I was like, okay, like I have this thing that I don't talk about to people, right? But here I'm allowed to write an essay about whatever I want, right? I'm allowed to write multiple essays, right? About whatever topic that I want to write about. And so I remember talking to my counselor and I was like, you know, like, is it okay to talk about mental health when you're supposed to be talking about, you know, something that, you know, makes them seem like makes the like application officers view you as like, you know, a good candidate or whatever, right? So I was like, I remember like people saying like, you know, don't talk about your mental health in your college essays, right? And I was like, but I want to, like, that's such a big part of my identity, whether I like it or not. And because like my,
I'm saying that that's your parents saying that you don't want to share that.
yeah,
Is it's your parents saying that you don't want to talk about your mental health issues there in your essay because that's not something you should feel you should talk about.
yeah, but obviously like I did anyways, and I remember submitting it and I was like to my counselor like, okay, but what if they don't like it? Like, you know, what if they don't think it's like, you know, like, you know, like I have like, what if they think it's like a weakness, right, instead of a strength, right? So I was always like nervous, and like when I got accepted I was like, oh, like it turns out like it's okay to talk about it. Like that was like such a big moment for me, like not just because um like I'm like Chinese American and like, you know, whole model minority myth is supposed to, you're supposed to like succeed or whatever, but at the same time like that was such a turning point because I was like, okay, like, you know, if some like stranger reads it and they're like, oh, like this doesn't make them weak, like it makes them a good addition to our class, like I was like, okay, like maybe I can talk about it. And so I started like after that happened I was like a lot less like quiet and like shy and stuff like that. And I was just talking about it, especially since quarantine happened with COVID. Like I've been trying to do like online stuff and like researching online and just trying to like educate myself and sort of catching up on those lost years, right? Like speaking out twice as loud, right? Because I couldn't speak up before, right? It's kind of like compensating for a lot of the stuff that I missed. Yeah.
Cool. Well, and now that you mentioned COVID, can you share with me a little bit about your experience during this last several months, and how did that impacted your mental health, and how did you see that impacting the mental health of individuals such as you're in your age group?
I think a lot of times you don't know what people deal with just because the stuff that you see on social media isn't indicative of what they go through, right? So again, my community is pretty it's like upper middle class, so I feel like a lot of times what you see on the surface level is that everyone's at home, like doing well, going to work, like doing their school, like just everyone seems fine, right? But under the surface there's a lot of like tension, like if you're living with your family, it's like like having to interact with them all the time instead of like having to go to school and then coming back and having that like partial interaction, if that makes sense. So a lot of students I've talked to, they're like, I don't like I don't know how I feel about being at home all the time. Other students, they like sort of thrive on that. A lot of students feel like at home is where they should be, on their computers, always doing something online. So it really depends on like sort of like what they're comfortable with. In terms of like COVID as a whole, like I think that since that's happened, a lot of students have sort of like shown their like true colors, if that makes sense. Because since that happened, like quarantine happened, and kind of gives everyone the ability to make choices, right? So like, should I go out and hang out with my friends, or should I do the right thing and like not do that, right? Or like wear masks and like social distance and whatever. So like when people post on social media, there's a lot of like cancel culture, or, like judging, like oh, this person posted like a group photo, like they weren't wearing masks, right? And then it's like, how do we perceive that, right? Do we perceive them as sort of like someone who is careless, or do we sort of brush that off and be like, it's just a person that's made like a questionable choice, right? So I think like with COVID, a lot of people have sort of been quick to judge whether it's for good or for bad, other people's actions as it relates to like the health and safety of the people around us. And I'm not sure if that's like a mental health issue or not, but I just think that there's been a heightened sense of like, people are quick to judge and people are quick to call each other out, especially okay with like racism and stuff like that. Like I think what a good thing that's happened is like people are like educating themselves and starting to realize like, hey, like I have friends or I have people that I know that aren't completely anti-racist, and if they post something that isn't like vibing with my values, like I'm going to call them out on it. So like I think people have been more comfortable with speaking out, which I think is a plus on their mental health, and people have been more comfortable with just kind of putting their foot down, like refusing to compromise on their values, and sort of stuff like that. So like I don't know if that makes sense, but I just think like COVID has definitely shaped people in different ways, and quarantine has definitely shaped people, especially how they perceive the world and how they deal with sort of the negative influences in their life.
Yeah, cool. Question about the intergenerational trauma, and that's something that I believe it's going to be and it already is a significant issue, especially among immigrants and among immigrants who faces a lot of challenges. For example, I mean, this world, everywhere you look at it, there's people migrating from one part to the other because of war, because of disease, because of starvation, whatever. So your parents came to the U.S. for educational reasons or for job opportunity. Were there any trauma associated with their coming to the U.S. Or how did they came into the U.S.?
I mean, I don't know if I want to like talk about it in detail, but
Okay. Oh, okay. No, that's
I
fine.
mean, like I think that again, if you look back at history, especially with China and like other like East Asian countries, like the Immigration Act of 1965, I think, I'm not sure if that's the right year, but there is like a sense that like what contributes to the model minority myth is that a lot of those immigrants tend to be like sort of educated, or like they have the potential to be like highly educated, right? So then that contributes to like, oh, like if this group of people are like supposedly high educated and they come to the United States, right? That means all Asians are like highly educated when they come to the United States. And that kind of contributes to like the issue of like the model minority myth and how that's so skewed, right? Because it's like hyper focused on just one of many different groups, right? Especially like East Asian or maybe even like a little bit of South Asia. Like it's so like Asia's so big. Like I think I talked about this already, but
Yes,
it's
yes,
just
yes.
that
Yeah,
yeah.
I understand that. I'm just trying to trying to dissect a little bit and see whether or not there is any impact that may have been driven by a traumatic experience that they have been through, that maybe they're still stressed out about it and they're still dealing with it. And I think intergenerational trauma is something that definitely is a big issue. And like I said, and that's what I'm just trying simply to expand on.
Yeah. I mean, like with anxiety, I know it's like I didn't know before, but it's apparently it's genetic because like my
Hmm.
mom has it, and that was caused by like early childhood, like something that happened in her childhood. So like it's like you can't be sure if something's genetic, right? Because like when you have something, you can't be like it's genetic, right? You don't know, right? But
Hmm.
I suspect that it is, and I think that for a lot of families who have gone through stuff, like a lot of the stuff does have a genetic like background, right? And you kind of like you kind of see it, and you're like from an outsider, you're like, oh, okay, I can see where that comes from, right? So like I don't know how to like explain it, but it is pretty like I think genetics is sort of like the like unseen influence, right? Because like a lot of times in psychology we're super focused on like social factors, right? We look at the family and we look at the social like sphere and like the friends, the peers, the teachers and stuff like that, like who influenced this person and like how has the person changed because of those people, right? And we also look at like psychological factors, like is the person naturally super like hyper or naturally like super sensitive like emotionally, right? We look at those factors and we look at cultural factors sometimes, but genetically I feel like there's not a lot of there hasn't been a lot of like dents made in that area because it's like kind of it's like a lot there needs to be a lot more resources allocated to like expanding on genetic research and sort of how exactly that's like manifested in mental health and stuff like that. So
Yeah. Is there any pressure to succeed in your situation, in your family,
wait, could you
on
repeat
you?
that? Sorry.
Was there pressure to
Mm,
succeed?
I mean it I feel like again with that is like it's more in comparison to other people. Like I know people who families push them a lot more, and I also know people whose families push them a lot less. So it's like I don't know where I stand with that, and I
Hmm.
don't know, like where like relative to other people, it's like very hard to determine like whether there is a pressure. I think like looking back, I don't think there was like the pressure. I think it was mostly like me. Like I just wanted to make sure that like I had everything in line. Like I wanted to push
Right.
myself. Um, but then a psychologist would look at that and be like, okay, but is she pushing herself or is she pushing herself because of these like perceptions and community and like all that other stuff? So like I think it's like me calling the shots, but sometimes I feel like I'm being influenced, right, by some abstract notion of like culture and like, you know, like those stereotypes and stuff like that. So it's kind of convoluted in that sense. But I think like I've sort of moved past that, and right now I'm kind of in a spot where I'm like, I don't have that anymore, right? Like all the anchors have been like, let up, right? So I don't feel that as much as I used to.
Right. Right. I was very impressed by the first slide that you showed, where the economic situations and the economic disparities contributing to the impact on mental health services, and also the fact that so many Asian really don't get the mental health care that they need. And it seemed to be the numbers that you show really seem to pretty much in line to what we see in Black communities in the United States, with probably a higher percentage of people not having insurance and not having access to health care. It's really a serious issue, and it's something that I think that we as a society really need to start thinking about. So, in addition to the barriers of lack of insurance, there's also what you mentioned in your slide, the stigma in those cultures that really stops them from being out there and reaching out the help that they need. So, is there any particular message that you would like to share with people your age, with someone who have struggled with mental health issue, but seem to have done quite well and able to stand up here and talk about it freely and openly? Is there any message that you'd like to deliver and let people know?
Again, like it's just like everyone experiences this so differently, and I feel like I'm pretty like privileged and lucky, right? Just to be able to talk about it and like to be where I am, if that makes sense. Um, but I mean, I would just say like I don't. I really just said like I'm about to say something, but I don't really know what I'm about to say. But like I would say like maybe be more open to like taking the first step, right? Like instead of waiting for someone to reach out to you and be like, hey, like, do you want to do this? Like, it doesn't even have to be like something big, right? It can be like, do you want to join this, or do you want to maybe meet up like sometime? Like, I feel like if you start like setting into the mindset of like taking the first step and taking initiative, I feel that like a lot of doors will open in terms of like finding opportunities to speak, like weaving those in, like when you're talking to your friends, like it it really doesn't happen until you take the first step, especially within like communities where like if you live in a family that is pretty closed and doesn't really talk about mental health as much. um like it's really important to sort of there needs to be someone who starts the conversation, right? And it can't always be your family, right? Like they might start the conversation for something else. Like if you're in trouble, like they might approach you and be like, hey, like we need to talk because you did something wrong, or like, hey, like I noticed this, right? But in the topic of mental health, like that's like the conversation is mostly like in your hands, if that makes sense. Like if you're able to like just find a time to like sit your family down and like just talk, like initiate the conversation, like find the right time for them, right, when they're not too busy or not too stressed, and like kind of plan ahead and like just have that conversation, right? Because you'll feel like you'll you'll only feel regret if you don't, like if you are in the situation where you're able to have that conversation like healthily, like just go for it, like if there's nothing stopping you, of course, right? It's better to do something and then be like, yeah, that could have been better, than to just not do it and be like, oh, I should have done it, right? It was the perfect time and I should have done it, right? So it's just like you just gotta like, you got no regrets. I don't know if that makes sense. You just gotta do it.
No, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to really uh, 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 step up and and then communicate and share your feelings and share your emotions and share those challenges with your parents. And then, like, I like the idea of really picking up the right time to be able to do that, sit down when things are not stressful, or when they, and share with them your emotions, share that with them your story, share with them, and also present to them the opportunity to help you. I'm here, I'm dealing with those challenges, and I need help, and I need help from you. And I think as long as you're not accusing them of being responsible for what you're going through, makes a lot of sense. And then and simply trying to build on that communication, on that openness and that dialogue to find a solution, to find the help that you need, which could really be tremendously important to reduce the risk of many, many other problems and situations that might occur in your life. Well, on behalf of the A.B. Korkor Foundation, we truly thank you, Claire, for stepping up and coming out here and talking to us about this with a large number of audience. And I thank all of you for joining us on this webinar. And you will be able to watch this webinar at any time in the future by going to our website, AAPI.org, and it will also be available on YouTube. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for supporting us in the past and continuing to support us into the future. I really appreciate it. We are here for you. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon on another webinar.
Thank you.